A check-in interview with Jason. What has changed since the last time we talked, back in 2021? Why are corporates suddenly paying for low-carbon grain? And what does it have to do with virtual digital twins? And why is it such a potentially disrupting technology? And what does it have to do with gaming and Scottish whisky? This is the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast, Investing as if the planet mattered, where we talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities, and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land and our sea, grow our food, what we eat, where and consume. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. To make it easy for fans to support our work, we launched our membership community, and so many of you have joined us as a member. Thank you. If our work created value for you, and if you have the means, and only if you have the means, consider joining us. Find out more on gumroad.com/investing-in-regen-ag. That is gumroad.com/investing-in-regen-ag, or find the link below. Welcome back to another episode with the founder and director of REGENFARM, who we had here with us in July 21. I was convinced it was last year, but it says something about the years, I think, so it's many podcasts ago. And he is now also a sustainable agriculture specialist at Cefetra, which is a large supply chain manager and a large grain trader, which is one of those companies we never really hear of, but touches a big chunk of what we eat and what we consume every day. And we have a fascinating deep dive ahead of us into the world of digital twins, into the world of supply chains, into the world of payments for ecosystem services and all of that. So I'm very happy to have you back on the show. Jason, welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice to be back again. It does seem just like yesterday, but it's been a few years.
I know. I mean, because I've referred to the episode often, I think it's one where we discussed keyline design at scale and keyline design. If you don't know, I will link the episode below, of course, in the show notes. But it really is a technique that has been mostly used, I think, in permaculture and restoration agriculture, like how to plant trees on contour. And it's normally, I mean, we discussed it at length, but it's normally done by hand, almost like walking the land with a laser, and you found a way to do that with software and at large scale. So I was fascinated to unpack that, but of course we didn't get into any of the grain stuff as you were not doing that yet. So first of all, let's unpack a bit. It was in Nigeria, I think, the big project. What is happening with the keyline design, the super accurate keyline design work you were doing back in 2021?
Yeah, well, it's still going on. We have a project now up and running in northern Nigeria in the state of Jigawa, and that's in cooperation with some local grain traders there who are in contact with a big footprint of smallholder farmers, each one farming about 1 hectare, 1.5 hectares each. But there's 30,000 of them, so that adds up to quite a big scale. And so you can imagine to put a design in place for each one of them would be a really lot of work going around 30,000 farmers. So we do use satellite technology, data coming from remote sources, and then use the technology we've designed to place onto that landscape. Key point, key line design, as well as other features, crop selection, water management, resources, that kind of thing. So you've got this patchwork of smallholder farmers aggregating together into a landscape, and then that landscape heading in the right direction of soil regeneration. And the point is to make those smallholder farmers more resilient, make their farms more resilient, their farm businesses more resilient. And that is done by putting lots of carbon back in the system, quite simply. Once you've got carbon going back into the system, that landscape holds more water. If you've got more water, it's more resilient to climate change. And the carbon going back into the landscape becomes an additional revenue stream. So they might be reducing soybean or rice or a range of other crops, hibiscus or maize or something like that. But now then the carbon going into the landscape can be monetized and layer on a complementary revenue stream for them. And we've got this great relationship developing with the Nigerian Sovereign Investment Authority, which is the kind of national oil reserve pension fund, if you like. And they're trying to apply funding into other sectors that isn't the oil and gas industry, to take care of rural populations a bit more, and especially in the north where there aren't any oil and gas reserves. Agriculture is the main thing. So redeploying some of that national capital into large-scale projects for smallholder farmers is not only good for the economy, but it's also the right thing to do. So it's great to have that project up and running. It's a long-term thing. Slow approaches often yield the best results. Slow and steady wins the game, sort of thing. So we're progressing steady with those smallholder farmers, and the results are coming slowly. We've got some nice connections developing with potential exports of those products, as well as the massive national market, of course. But it's great to see our technology being deployed in reality, in a real situation that positively affects farmers, their economy, their response and adaptation to climate change.
And so what enables this technology that without the technology wouldn't be possible? Apart from the scale, of course, but I think how would you define, what makes, I'm always interested in enabling technology and not ag tech for the sake of ag tech, let's digitalize everything. But in this case, what is possible now that wouldn't have been possible without this tech?
It starts from a social angle, really. We were, this whole project was started by UK overseas aid to enable smallholder farmers to get into the game, as it were. It's really challenging to work with one farmer, but if you have 30,000 farmers, it's almost impossible unless you have a system that is digitized, that can look directly from using remote data on how each one of those farms is doing and what can happen if we redesign it. And it puts 30,000 farmers into the game. I'm saying the game. It's not a game. It's their lives. And it's a really important. But it enables them to utilize that data to make their farms more productive, more profitable, layer on this additional revenue stream, and participate in a solution to climate change in their area.
And who's doing the work on the ground, in terms of, because the monitoring piece I get, but who's doing the advisory work, or okay, these could be the keyline strips, or these could be the compost. How is the transition or the change on the ground being communicated, or being done at the end?
Sure. So it is a blend of technology and people on the ground, and each one of those farmers is connected with an off-taker, a trader that it's a commercial relationship. So if farmer wants to produce soybean, then there's a commercial contract with that off-taker. And if the farmer's way of production is altered slightly and carbon is sequestered into that farm, then he's not only selling soybean, he's selling low carbon soybean. And that's again a commercial relationship. There's a slight premium on that product, but also the potential to monetize carbon credits as well. So it's based on a commercial relationship. This isn't an experiment and seeing if it worked. This is actually Naira changing hands for crops produced in the right way, a climate resilient way.
And this low carbon crop, you see there's a commercial interest for that from traders or end consumers, because that's driving this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is a market-driven demand, and that sort of brings me on to the role I'm now playing with Cefetra on a large scale in Europe, where the road to zero emissions, being net zero by 2030. A few years ago, it was a pledge that was made, and not a lot of action being made towards meeting that target. But now, as 2030 looms, I mean, we hadn't spoken for a few years, but imagine how these big companies feel now that the 2030 deadline is in their headlights, and they have to make headway. And if there's a way they can reach that target quickly, it's by reducing their Scope 3 emissions, those emissions that are incurred when you purchase in grain products or whatever food products from the supply chain. You also take on that carbon liability. So if those grain products are lower in carbon, your Scope 3 emissions are less, and therefore you can get to net zero in a more manageable way. And that's what's driving things. A few years ago, it was just a nice idea. Now it's a reality with order books, future trades piling up, really. And so it switches from, okay, are we able to sell low carbon grains into the market? Yes, we are. That's great. The next step is, do we have enough farmers producing those low carbon grains? No, we don't. So then it's kind of this positive feedback loop where you have to grow in a balanced way. You don't want a big pile up of low carbon grains produced and nobody buying them, or you don't want a massive demand for those low carbon grains and no farmers producing them. So it's a ratcheting up on both sides, but in significant numbers now. So it's completely market driven, which gives, I think it's really important, it gives the farmer line of sight directly to be rewarded for producing low carbon grains, rather than just, oh, somebody's asking for it, whatever, it might happen, it might not. It's a big motivation for farmers to change their behavior and become more climate resilient.
And we're going to get to the amounts, etc. But are you scared, like some of these companies, like toning down their 2030 goals, like we see maybe in the electric mobility world, like we see a bit of waves, let's say, and then it seems like Unilever, I think, went down on a few goals, etc. Like, is that a fear you have potentially, that this is scaled down a bit or a lot with changing elections and changing places, or the momentum is there somewhere, like even if it gets toned down 20% or 10%, it doesn't really affect the market and say the farmers? Because the last thing we want is promise a lot of things to farmers, and then in 2 years or in a year it's like, actually, yeah, we don't really care about Scope 3 anymore.
I think politics gets in the way of everything, doesn't it? At some point,
yeah,
and people use it as an excuse, and so I think partly those Scope 3 emission targets are just being massaged a bit, but the overwhelming direction is to go down the low carbon route. I mean, these big brands, these big food brands, have to get there, right, and stay there. And so there's an overwhelming direction to be in that low carbon purchasing space for raw food products, because it's the right thing to do. And quite often those big food brands, it's shareholder driven, right? It's not just about a desire to become net zero, it's the ability to access finance for those businesses. The financial sector, the insurance sector is demanding it. So,
and do you see that also on like the is grain a crop where, let's say, low carbon means also better, like more resilient farming? I mean, we started with that. Let's say, is the CFO and the procurement guy or girl or woman also paying attention to this because of supply chain issues? And is this not just, because shareholders, okay, and because of reporting, okay, but is this becoming, because we had a long interview with Land Banking Institute, and Sonia was really saying like, we go where it hurts, like orange juice, olive oil, like where now, like it's just painful for farmers and for suppliers to get stuff. And that's where we move. Cacao is another one. Is grain one of those crops where it hurts?
Yeah, and so it's a really good point, actually. So the decision makers in those big food brand organizations, it's the CFO, it's the purchasing teams, it's the marketing teams. All their thinking seems to have lined up, and for this to be now, first of all, is it available?
That's really different compared to 3 years ago. Huh? That's really
different. Yeah. If you start to have this conversation with the food brand 3 years ago, you wouldn't last 5 minutes in their office. Now, we're inviting them to see actually what a climate resilient farm looks like. A farm that's embraced these ideas of, we all know it's reducing utility, using cover crops, switching from nitrogen fertilizer to something else, a whole mixture of those three things. But quite often, those purchasing teams don't know what that looks like on a farm. And so introducing them to a farm, either physically or using this new virtual twin technology we've also developed, it helps immerse them in that environment. Literally, on a farm. Literally, they're surrounded by it, and they can use that in their marketing, in their purchasing programs over the years. And so it becomes, this is where we sit in the middle of a supply chain, and we can almost pull those two ends together using technology, using on-farm meetings, using the virtual twin to say, look, this is a real thing. You're making a real contribution. Let's not think it's a painful thing. Let's think it's a good thing to do. Yeah, absolutely. It's an investment in the future. It's an investment in your resilient supply chain, because without resilient farmers, you don't have any resilient low-carbon grains being produced. So we try to look at the big picture and immerse people in it.
And just like the immersing piece we mentioned, we had a pre-conversation about this, like and we'll get to that, the digital twin, and now combining that, or almost with some virtual reality headsets, etc. You can literally walk on these farms and see what it could be, and which I think is fundamental, because most of us don't have that sort of almost creativity or potential to see what a heavily degraded farm could look like. And most of us consider anything green not to be, like, to look okay and nice. We had a peatland rewetting discussion yesterday, and a piece of peatland in Lower Saxon in Germany looks fine and green, but actually it's emitting like 20 tons of CO2 a year. And so for the untrained eye, it looks okay. But if you could see what potential is there and what actually is being emitted and what could grow there, et cetera, I think it becomes a very different experience to see what a diverse farm could look, or see what a key line, et cetera, et cetera. But going back to the farmer, let's say in the UK, you're working with, like, what does it mean for him or her, like, practically, to start growing lower carbon grain for one of these big brands that's interested in that, practically on the farm itself? I mean, you mentioned a few things, but also financially. Like, is this meaningful? I don't need exact numbers, but is this meaningful and not just a nice pocket change extra to do this? Because if it's not meaningful, why would we?
Yeah, it's meaningful. It's not, you're not going to change your profit and loss by millions here, but you're probably changing a lot in terms of reduced volatility, resilience. Your whole business is more resilient. Your whole production is more resilient. And so our experience working with UK farmers is they can do some very practical things, which they're probably already thinking about or have already started to do in sort of test plots around the farm. And the three biggest levers are reducing tillage from ploughing to min-till or min-till to zero-till, use of cover crops, particularly multi-species cover crops, and then switching away from chemical nitrogen fertilizer to some organic alternative. I mean, those are the three biggest levers farmers can pull, and it fits in with their normal operations. We're not asking them to do anything out of the ordinary. They've got the
Key line design or
machinery
forestry for anything. Yeah.
No,
for example,
no. So that's further down the track. For grain farmers, it's what do you do normally, conventionally, and how do you just tweak it a bit to go more sustainable, and then sequester carbon into the system or reduce your emissions of carbon.
And how much does it mean for emissions? Like if you like a convention, of course, it's difficult to say, it depends on context. But if you do those three things well, is it a 10% drop? Is it like what do you see? How much lower is the low carbon?
The best, the figures are different on every farm. The best way of looking at it is a net result of what's the amount of carbon sequestered per hectare in a field, which is a mixture of reduced emissions or sequestration. It comes up with a figure. And it's somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 tons per hectare per year. So that's good. It's a positive result. And if you multiply that by the price of carbon for a carbon certificate in the markets, which is about £25 per ton, so you're looking at somewhere, £50, £75 per hectare for doing something that's not too difficult. And that's a great start, a great reward and motivation for farmers to keep on doing that. Because that's the point, right? You don't want to just do it 1 year and then revert back. It's the start of a transition, a long-term transition. Making that money every year pays for or starts to fill the gap in the UK, where farmers are going to be losing their BPS payment in a few years' time. So it starts to fill that gap by doing something positive with the environmental management of the farm. So this is just one of those first easy steps a farmer can make. And then in my experience, I think as we discussed before, once there's been a few quick wins on the farm like that, and that seemed to have worked, the next thing their farmer starts thinking, what else can I try? What other interventions can I use? And then we go down the path of perhaps more complicated key line design. Some of the farmers we're working with in the UK are already planting agroforestry systems. And then you're sort of on the next tier of farm resilience. You've gone up from... the carbon sequestration figure goes up from 1.8 to maybe 3.8, or depending on circumstances, and then your farm really begins to sort of power up, and you can drop off your fertilizer a bit more, you can stop ploughing a bit more, you've got those trees in the system, all those additions to that farming system in the UK or anywhere just increases complexity, and with complexity comes resilience. All those fundamental principles of regenerative agriculture start to kick in. But we must be careful in the UK context. We started to talk about regenerative agriculture, and that term itself was met with quite a lot of resistance. They say we're not regenerative farmers, we are climate positive farmers. Okay, well, you can, that's also
For
good.
Yourself.
Labeling is important or not, as the case may be, but those practices all fit into the same direction of travel. It's fantastic. You're trying to do this, call it what you want, but that's what we want to encourage more farmers to do. And what's really important, I think, is having a cohort of farmers to say, look, we've been through 1 year of this. It was great. Our fields are in a slightly better shape. Our soil's coming along nicely. And that farmer to farmer, the peer to peer, cross cross advice sharing. It worked here like this, worked there like this. We're seeing that now start to happen, and that's great, right? It's kind of regen ag's gone viral sort of thing, which is what we all want to do, and that's a really pleasing result to see.
And when or how comes the digital twin and the technology piece in here, let's say? Because what you described until now sounds very low tech in a good way. I'm not saying, but how does the digital twin and software enable a lot of these or enable this to happen?
Yeah, so this is quite a story. When we done our first sort of wave of technology development, which was the key line design, and that's helping out with the design of a farm on a landscape scale, which is really important. We then kind of ran up against another problem of how will this look on my farm? How will my farm appear? I want to see it all there before I actually start to make some big interventions, because once you start to plant trees or dig swales or anything, they're quite permanent changes to the farm, so it's important to be able to visualize these interventions and not only just see a pretty picture of them, but calculate from real data how these systems alter how a farm behaves in terms of crop yield, water movement through the soil, all these types of real on-farm issues that make a difference. How does that look? And so our very talented technology design team said, well, what we need is to be able to walk around the farm, but in a virtual environment. And this is where my knowledge of all this stopped quite quickly. And they said, well, what we need is a virtual twin of a farm where you can, on the screen or through a set of goggles, walk around the farm and see, okay, there's my swale, there's my agroforestry system, I'm in the tractor now driving around, here's how it looks and behaves. And so we decided to look at, okay, is there anything else available like this? I think most people are familiar with Farming Simulator, the game you can play, and I was actually recently at the Llama show in the NEC in Birmingham. All these great huge machinery, quite impressive combines, tractors everywhere. But there was one, the biggest stand in Llama was Farming Simulator, and rows of people trying to stack bales quickly or plough fields quickly. It was quite amazing to see how that virtual environment has been embraced by the farming industry. You know, many millions of people every day play Farming Simulator, and I think the figure is something like, and 10% of those are farmers. So,
which is hilarious to think about. Like you spend all day on a tractor,
all day.
Not all day. You spend and then when you don't have to, but it means that it's a purpose, and it's not just a job. I think
people get a lot out. Yeah, people and non-farmers get a lot of appreciation about farming from it. So we thought you have to start technology development, I think, with a kind of an idea, a what-if moment. We said, well, what if a farmer, you know, he's been busy all day on the farm, what if they could actually go on a virtual twin of their farm and layer on some interventions, throw different climate change scenarios at it, weather scenarios, you know, what if it rained a lot this spring and there was a drought in the summer, what would happen? So we put our heads down into technology development, and we have now a virtual twin, which, we can create a virtual twin of any farm on Earth as long as we have the data to construct it. And it's using the underlying platform is using game technology, right? It's a platform to grab data. It could be digital elevation models, weather, climate, crop yield models, that kind of thing, and it constructs any farm on a 1 square meter basis. So every square meter of the farm is consider that like a data bin. and all the data goes on there, and the virtual twin is constructed. It's not just a pretty picture, it's actually a virtual model of how that 1 square meter will behave. And if it's a planted with wheat, there's wheat growth models, if it's a tree, if it's grass, whatever. So you can see how that field, that 1 square meter, will behave under different circumstances. So it's terrific to play around with. We actually constructed this model in northern Nigeria, where we have the richest data sets. So, most people have never been to northern Nigeria, certainly not here. So it's great to go to places you've not been, see what the actual farms look like. You can run the data forward. You can have 1 week every couple of seconds just to see what that season looked like. But the beauty of it is, with a virtual twin, you can have infinite variability. You can have infinite versions of the future. And so you begin to point the virtual twin towards different industries. Yes, it's good for farming, supply chain, see what crop yields will look like if the climate changes by 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, whatever. That's great. We all understand that. But then we made contact with the insurance industry that said, okay, well, this is interesting, because we're always trying to calculate what a 1 in 100 year event would be, like a flood event or a drought. And so they can now begin to run scenarios for that particular geography. Okay, what are the chances of this happening in that area? So we can run 1 million versions of the future and calculate those kinds of things. So the virtual twin sits in the middle, and then we can interface it with the food production, supply chain, insurance. There's probably many other things we can think of. The one I think that's the most interesting, and what I understand the least, is the gaming industry, where connecting...
Let's unpack that.
Yeah. Well, it's unpacking, or it's offering an opportunity for the people who enjoy playing games, which are many people in the world, with farmers, which are many people in the world.
Not enough, but more.
Yeah. But the linkages between those two groups of populations, there's some crossover, like Farming Simulator, of course. But I had a great idea, if we can get gamers somehow to use the virtual twin to design perfect farms and real farms in this area, and then the farmer takes that design and implements it in the field. It's the way the gaming industry can cooperate with the farming industry and all get to a place, a climate resilient place, where we all want to be. So this is just something we're working on at the moment. It's a little bit crazy and wild, but hey, it might work.
Yeah, and I think what makes, I'm trying to remember who said it, what's great about the gaming industry, you can just restart again. Like, you game over, you start. Like, there's of course you shouldn't do that on a real farm. I think it was Jason Clay of WWF or something, a long time ago, said, what's interesting is this tendency of experimentation and doing 10,000, 1 million digital twins, and just see 1 million scenarios, what happens. Because what I realize is that we've only scratched the surface of complexity design on farms. And we need to take into consideration, of course, the climate models and commercial context, social context, like what makes sense where. But that question of, okay, let's just play and design and keep iterating until we find something that fits, run it with farmers and see why probably in many cases it doesn't make any sense, but keep iterating until you find designs that make a lot of sense, especially in more permanent crops. The design is going to be fundamental, because not that you can take the tree and move it somewhere else. Like with animals and arable, you have a bit more flexibility, but also there you need to, and we've had a conversation that actually on, I think I have to find it, but Sensornomics? No, I don't remember the company But they were like, how do you, especially with rotations, to make sure that you don't get into trouble. Because if you do your rotations well, great. But if you look 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years into the future, you can start seeing, okay, where does it make sense in terms of machinery to have in the place? Where does it make sense to have my barley next year? Where does it make sense to have this next year? Where does it make sense to have my compost facility? Where does, like, all of these questions we rarely answer with software. And that's where technology is really, really good to run many scenarios and flag all the ones that don't work, and then have hopefully a few that are most promising. And I think in design, we've done that in architecture and many other places, but in farm design, I've yet to meet somebody, of course, now I'm going to get emails, but like to do that and to like, what are we going to plant where and why, and how does it make sense? How does it look? How does it feel like when you do that before you actually do it, which is a super costly and risky move. If you have 40 harvests in your farming life, you're not going to risk a few for an interesting design. But if you could walk through it, who knows if it triggers something.
Yeah. And what I find really interesting is those two sets of populations, the farmers and the gamers, their minds work really differently, don't they? It's the farmers who are really in a serious job, and like you said, they're very risk averse. They don't want to try something and it's playing around with their very expensive farm asset, or they'd rather stay on a slow and steady transition. Absolutely,
it's low margins. Like don't. But yeah, in a game you go like, okay, let's play again. Who cares?
Yeah. So the extreme of this was when Dan, our technology development director, showed our virtual twin demo to his local school. And he got the kids playing it, and they said, wow, yeah, and I don't know, they find it really easy to engage with this technology, driving a tractor up and down, walking around, exploring, that kind of thing. It's good they can go and explore a farm from their classroom, fantastic. But then they said, you should stick this on a platform where we can all play, and then we can interact. And if you put it on something like Fortnite, we could all play, we could pay, you could raise a lot of money, and then that could be another source of income for the farmers. And we're going, yep, hadn't thought of that. That's a good one. So they're themselves beginning to explore ways in which this reconnection with farms can be made. And perhaps it's with the virtual twin in the middle being that place where people can meet from different backgrounds, ages, mindsets, that kind of thing. So we've only just scratched the surface of how this could be used. I think we've got a great technology, but there's a long way to go in developing user cases, business models, that kind of thing. But at least we've got now something we can talk about. Yeah, and look around and immerse ourselves in.
I'm looking. Are you coming to Groundswell and bringing it? Because I'm looking forward to.
Oh yeah, I'll be at Groundswell, and I'll ask for a version on my phone where you can have a play around with it, because it's just so fascinating to me. I mean,
and with the computing power now, it becomes more realistic every 2 days, basically. And I think we really lack. Because we look at fields and we think this is normal, and we look at landscapes and we think this is normal, and what is it called? Baseline syndrome. It's not normal. Like, it's so empty of life, hence the slogan of Wild Farm, full of life. Like, it's so difficult for a farmer, but also for anybody else to imagine what a place could look like. And I'm not saying let's design the most complex, crazy, but even just diverse cover crops. Like, okay, what do the insects sound like? What do they feel like? How do you? Yeah. And we've seen a video. I think our first 3 partners. I'll put it in the links below as well. He just filmed a place where they had diverse cover crops before the chestnuts, because they're doing chestnuts in the US, came in, and another place, and just the difference in sound and the difference in bzzz around you, and but for most people that. Like, to even imagine how much biodiversity could be on a place, on a plot, and how much different crops, etc. Like, what does that make a place feel like? Yeah, we're just not going to see that. We're going to be stuck in an office in London. We're going to be in different offices. We're going to be buying grains for Scottish whiskey. But how many times do you visit a farm and are able to see the potential?
I think you touched on something very fundamental there. We've been talking about carbon carbon in the system, low carbon grains, that kind.
Very sexy, right?
No, it's not, because it's intangible. You can't actually see it, and they're build suspicion. Is this real? What are we doing here? But as soon as you go beyond carbon and start to talk about water issues, biodiversity issues on a farm, you can actually see it. Your other senses start to work, and this for a supply chain manager and the food brand supplied on the end is really important, because this is a way that those food brands can help their consumers connect with changing practices on a farm. So, yeah, the farms produced low carbon grains, whatever, low carbon malting barley for the Scottish whisky industry, for bread makers, whatever. But what does that mean? However, or as well, on the farm, the biodiversity has increased, the pollinators have increased, there's more water storage and little lakes forming on the farm. Actually, that's visual. You can see that, you can hear it. You can become immersed in it, and that message, that visual of what the result is on the farm, can be used far more by those food brands for marketing their loaf of bread or their can of beer or whatever it is. So you're beginning to connect and use different parts of that consumer messaging, that whole way in which they communicate what the brand is about. But importantly and fundamentally, this is where farmers get to play a really big role in this and be rewarded financially, environmentally, and I think many of them personally, that they've been part of this transformation. And they must be, as you said, farming is a low margin business these days. But if a brand is willing to pay for that data, see it in a virtual twin, see it in reality, then this is another financial reward and motivation for farmers to keep on doing that, maintain what they've done, do some more, and increase pollination percentages. These are tangible things that people can see and hear and touch, and that's where you go beyond that abstract carbon into a more visual result, a virtual twin result that you can show. Okay, this farm's really going well, and this is how it has physically changed. So it's a fascinating thing to be involved with.
Yes, and I was thinking, it's fundamentally different than showing a pretty picture or a pretty video or an even immersive video of the field, because it's data driven and virtual, and it can maybe be interacted with other sensors, etc. But you touched upon it, like it is different because the farmer gets paid for it. It doesn't get paid for the nice sign, this is a biodiversity friendly farm or something, and of course we always know there are pennies on the dollar basically being paid for things like that, but this is driven by that, and almost as a byproduct you have actually something visual and actually something immersive. But it's not the main thing. The main thing is the data. It's the carbon beyond carbon. It's the layered the extra layers basically that is on the tons of grain or there, and that makes it different, because otherwise it's just, again, pretty pictures like, oh, can we come to your farm and you're doing so amazing work. We don't really want to pay for it. We just want to take a lot of your time and do a photo shoot and a film shoot and an interview and a this and a that, and yeah, that's not going to move the needle.
No, and you've touched on really a very important aspect of a virtual twin of this beyond carbon space. It's data. It's the farmer's data. They own the data, and they give permission for it to be used for a price. And so that money then comes back to the farmer. The data is packaged into a virtual twin, so it's usable, visual. Can be used for branding, marketing, messaging purposes, reporting purposes as well. But yeah, really important that the farmer owns the data, gives permission for it to be used, and for at a cost, and then that value goes back to the farmer, and then begins a good feedback loop. Because next year you want to know, has water and biodiversity increased on the farm, and here's the data to prove it. And so this can continue on a small test set of farms and gradually grow the number of farms using this system. And it's how we can all check, right, whether this whole
thing is real.
the thing is real. What the farmers are doing are making a difference. Are we actually? They're on the front line of climate change. If they're doing a great job, let's reward them to do some more, because the farmers and the land they control can get us all out of this climate change mess we're in.
And as a final piece, because we're running out of time, what has Scottish whiskey to do with this? We had a pre-call, and I took notes, of course, and I was like, okay, we go from gaming to Scottish whiskey, which probably is going to be the title of this thing. Anyway, but why is Scottish whiskey relevant for this conversation?
So, exactly. Well, maybe some people drink Scottish whiskey when they're playing gaming. I don't know. But anyway, I
or listening
work
to
for
this. Could be. Yeah.
Why not? Why not? Put your feet up and have a glass. So I'm the sustainable agriculture specialist for Cefetra, which is a supply chain manager in the UK. And a large proportion of the grain supplied to the Scottish whisky industry is sourced by us, aggregated from farms. And some of those farms now are producing low carbon grains. So it's interesting how those distillers are kind of one of the first to move in this Scope 3 emission space, because their product has to go into a barrel for 10 years before it comes out. So what they're purchasing now, low carbon grains, which has a direct effect. By the time it comes out the barrel, it's past 2030, right? So it's very important for them to be ahead of the game. They got the biggest margins. They can move quicker.
That's the reason. They must think long term.
Yeah. It's so who knows what branding they're going to come out with on a bottle of their product. Low carbon whiskey. I don't know what it will be, but anyway, they've made the move. They're now actively purchasing low carbon grain, so they can be in this new space, be in this new low carbon space, and the challenge therefore is to keep that market driven demand going and introduce new farmers into the ecosystem services program that Cefetra has to build up the number of farmers that can supply low carbon grains. So it's really encouraging to see. The first cohort of farmers are in. We've got about 50 farmers in the UK doing this. We're looking for another 50, possibly 100 farmers next year to join. That's about 25,000 hectares we recruited this year. So it's not a small number, right? And who knows if
that's a lot.
Yeah, if the market takes off, then we'll need a lot more farmers. So we'll be publicising what we've done, reporting those real audited figures to the market, using our virtual twin on some of those farms to see if that can help encourage more farmers on one side and food brands on the other to join this low carbon space. So it's we feel pleased and proud to be part of it, and I'm certainly pleased to work with Cefetra to promote this scheme. It seems to be working. We're proud of it.
And a shout out to Soil Capital. You're spending a lot of time with us as well.
Of course,
Chuck,
yeah.
Friends of the show.
Yeah, Chuck. Thanks to Chuck.
He's
and
coming
the Soil
back
Capital
soon. He's
team.
coming back soon.
Yeah. So we've have a partnership with Soil Capital, who do that very technology-based carbon certificate registry function in partnership,
which is then sold to not to you, right? To the end, to the Heineken's, to the Scottish whiskey brands, etc. Like, who's the buyer of this?
Yeah, it's those certificates. Yeah, the ultimate brand on the end. Those insets are sold there, and so we couldn't do it without Soil Capital. We've become close working partners over the last few months. It's going really well, and we're looking forward to the future to grow together.
Amazing. I want to thank you so much, Jason, for joining us here with a lot of technical issues at the beginning, but we managed to have audio. I hope, at least, if you're listening to this, we managed to get audio. And I was in a noisy environment as well. I hope it wasn't too disturbing, because it's just fascinating to dive into the world of virtual twins, gaming, and Scottish whiskey. And that it seems to be fundamentally changed since 3 years ago. I think that the brands coming into the space and starting to buy, and companies like Cefetra that are starting to supply and connect, and with all the issues of commoditization, etc., but starting to layer these layers of data on top of it, and an actual meaningful change for farmers on land and in their wallet is not to be sniffed at, I think. So I'm very happy to unpack that here. We only scratched the surface, but I'm happy to have this smaller deep dive, let's say.
Well, maybe we can get together at Groundswell, and I can show you, and maybe they'll have some Scottish whiskey there as well.
That would be nice. Yeah, looking forward to that.
Great, super. See you there.
Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. For the show notes and links we discussed in this episode, check out our website, investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/posts. If you like this episode, why not share it with a friend or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts? That really helps. Thanks again, and see you next time.